Hey, good morning. Welcome to It's Now or Never, Our Economy and the Race to Net Zero. Thank you for joining us this morning. This session is the part of the second annual Rising Economy Week hosted by the South Island Prosperity Partnership. This is just one of more than 20 sessions building momentum for a more resilient, innovative, sustainable, and equitable post-COVID world. My name is Jennifer Vornbrock, and I'm pleased to introduce today's session. I'm the Executive Director of Government and Community Relations at the University of Victoria and Vice Chair of the South Island Prosperity Partnership. This morning, I'm joining you virtually from my home here in Victoria, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the Lekwungen people, whose traditions and territory I gratefully work and live on, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Sanish people, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. Today's panel was made possible by the sponsorship of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solution, PICS, and the University of Victoria's VI3 Hub. This will be an exciting discussion, so my remarks will be brief. I bring greetings from our president, Dr. Kevin Hall, who had hoped to be here today, and he's a champion of the work that we're doing, particularly in the area of community engagement. Working with communities and partnering with our municipalities, industry, business, Indigenous governments, communities, NGOs, and many others is crucial to our shared prosperity in this region. In particular, we're committed to finding solutions and promoting sustainable futures, while upholding our commitment to truth and reconciliation and our values of equity, diversity, and inclusion. This conversation couldn't feel more urgent as our fellow British Columbians struggle with the very real consequences of the climate crisis. And I urge you, in your own way, nothing is too small, to find a way to help. Your panel this morning is an extraordinary group of individuals who will guide us through this very necessary and pressing conversation. It truly is now or never. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Evan Pivnick, apologies. Evan is a senior policy advisor with Clean Energy Canada, where he works to bring climate action and innovation together in order to build strong economies. Prior to joining Clean Energy Canada, Evan served as Chief of Staff to the BC Green Caucus during the 2017 to 2020 minority government, where he was deeply involved in the creation of Clean BC, British Columbia's climate strategy. Evan is also a graduate of the University of Victoria. Once again, thank you to SIP and to all of you. I'm really looking forward to this session. Over to you, Evan.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Jennifer said, I'm really grateful to SIP for asking me to help facilitate such an important conversation. I think it's clear and without a doubt, climate change is one of the greatest forces that shape our society and our economy in the coming decades. We all know what we're ultimately trying to get to. BC and Canada have established targets to be a net zero emitter of GHG emissions by 2050. But what does that actually mean? What does reaching net zero actually look like? And perhaps more importantly, what is it going to require of us and our economy? As I expect we're going to hear from our panelists, climate and economic policy go hand in hand, or they have to if we have a hope of reaching those targets. Today, I don't want to spend too much time at the end talking about 2050 and where we hope to be. I think we want to take our time today to discuss where we are now and what we have to do next in order to set ourselves on a path to decarbonize our economy and what the challenges and opportunities that decarbonization can lead to. So with that for context for the conversation today, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Sybil Seitzinger. She is an environmental studies professor at the University of Victoria and executive director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. PICS is a research and engagement network oriented towards delivering evidence-based and impactful climate change solutions. Next, we have Dr. Barbara Buchner, who is the Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. She's been named one of the 20 most influential women in climate change. Barbara advises leaders on climate, energy, and land use investments around the world. She's the lead author on CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance and directs the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. That's a climate finance incubator that leverages public-private collaboration to develop innovative climate finance instruments. Finally, we're going to be joined today by Trevor Mellinson. He's the Director of Communications at Clean Energy Canada, where he's worked since 2016. As a journalist before that, Trevor has held editorial roles at a number of Canadian publications, including the Canadian Business, BC Business, and Vancouver Magazine. So welcome to all three of you, and thanks for joining us today. Before we go into the questions themselves, I just wanted to give a quick walkthrough for everyone that's joining us today about how this is going to work. I've got a number of questions that we're going to use as prompts for a conversation between the four of us. Around the halfway mark, around 10:30, 10:35, we're going to turn to questions from you. So you can submit questions at any time through the Zoom Q&A below this video. This session is being recorded and you can submit your questions anonymously if you prefer. When we get to that point, I'll start to pull on questions that everyone that is watching has joined. To interact with the attendees, you can use Zoom or Whova Chat. The production team is going to be monitoring the chat and Q&A for those joining us through that app. Lastly, if you're going to be posting any takeaways to social media, please make sure you're using the hashtag #RisingEconomyWeek 2021. So let's dive into this. Barbara, Trevor, and Sybil, if we can keep answers to just a minute or two, I just want to make sure we can cover as much ground and make sure we can get through as many questions and pieces as possible. And maybe to start with, I think we should set the stage a little bit. So we're just a few weeks out of the United Nations Summit COP26, where nearly 200 nations met to look at the outcomes from the Paris Agreement and to chart a path for where we're going from here. So to each of you, and maybe starting with you, Barbara, where are we coming out of Glasgow? Has the conversation moved forward? Are we starting to see an acceleration of climate policy, or was Glasgow a missed opportunity?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure being part of this panel here. And yes, well, the narrative is highly contested. I think there's been kind of both sides, very strongly arguing for either, it was kind of a talking show, greenwashing, that's just the new climate denial. And on the other hand, it's been a huge achievement. For me, the glass is always half full. As always, it's been a step forward, but it's not enough. We all know that, obviously the UN negotiations is not where you really deliver the action. And I think it is a step forward, but not enough, because it's pretty tricky. I think that the problem that we have is that the jeopardy is much higher. We've heard the UNSG talking about code red for humanity, because we do have less time and the emissions are still rising. So we really need to bend the curve. And I think we've also seen that there's a very disparate picture within geography. So, but at the same time, I think, again, I am a glass half full person. So I've seen a lot of signs for hope and momentum. I think the attention is rising, awareness is rising. There have been, coalitions of companies, of governments, of civil society, and those of indigenous people that forced progress on a number of issues, such as, stopping deforestation, cutting methane, ending coal use, and boosting zero emissions vehicles. And that is important. And we've also seen kind of progress on increasing the finance pledge. And for me, I work very much on the finance area. That obviously is a key ingredient to ensuring that we, get on track towards a net zero sustainable future. But maybe just, and I know we should keep it short, but so I feel this process has started, and what we really need to do now is kind of make sure that we translate the pledges into concrete action. I think your focus on short term is really important, because I think we really need to see how can you make sure that all the announcements, all the pledges actually are held accountable, translate into concrete actions, near-time actions, and really make sure that we're not ending up in 2050 where it's actually too late to bend the curve, but really it's time to shift up a gear and really make sure that we are setting the enabling environments in place that can allow us to achieve the climate targets that have been set now, but also kind of prepare countries for next year's COP, where there is a commitment to again ratchet up ambition, come back with higher national goals, and hopefully that will then really allow us to go towards bending the curve. And maybe let me just stop here. I have lots of thoughts and look forward to discussing more around the issues here.
Yeah, I think we're going to be coming back a few times to that question of translating pledges to action and what that means sort of immediately here. But maybe to go to Sybil, from your perspective, Glasgow, step forward, step sideways, how have you viewed the results coming out of it?
Thank you, Evan, and thanks for including me in this panel discussion. Yeah, I've attended a number of COPs. I was in Copenhagen in 2009 when the 2-degree target was established, and even 1.5 was brought forward then. And then again in Paris, when much stronger commitments, quote unquote, were made to trying to stay below 2 and if possible 1.5. And then for Glasgow, actually, I attended remotely. so not in person, but took advantage of that ability as an official delegate to also participate online here from Victoria. But what I would like to say is that everything, I agree with everything that Barbara said. What I'd like to point out is, build on a little bit, is some of the additional alliances that were built. For example, there was an alliance called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was between France, Germany, the UK, the US, and the EU, which really was a groundbreaking partnership. And it was groundbreaking because it was with South Africa. And it's really those countries coming together to support South Africa in moving away from coal, which is their primary energy source, and to accelerate their transition to a low emission and resilient economy. So we've got these big international agreements, but what we need also, in which we see more and more coming forward, and I think particularly at Glasgow, or leading up to Glasgow, was these new alliances and partnerships that are not at the total global scale, but that are specific, trying to help specific emissions, either countries or sectors, decrease those emissions. So there were numerous new agreements at that level coming forward, which I think is an excellent sign, and actually I think has the real opportunity to see progress on them as we move forward. So I guess I came into COP in Glasgow not having necessarily high expectations, because as Barbara said, coming with agreements among essentially 200 countries is a huge challenge. And it's the implementation that goes after that that's really critically important, and how that happens can have many different forms, but some of these new partnerships are one of those ways.
Yeah, Sybil, I think that's been one of the most interesting takeaways in the conversation around, was it a step forward, step back, but what role does something like Glasgow actually play, and what should our expectations be in how it advances, or what at least it unlocks in conversations that spill out of it. So I also want to come back to that, but lastly, to, I guess, bring Trevor into the conversation, from your perspective, Glasgow.
Sure, I'll come at this with a bit of a Canadian lens, because that's what I know best. And for Canada, the biggest announcements actually came in anticipation of COP. This was a 5-year milestone COP following Paris. So the intention was for countries to increase their ambition, just as it will be in another 5 years. So in anticipation, was also a delayed COP that was supposed to happen last year. So in anticipation, Canada did increase its target to 40 to 45% emission reduction from 2005 levels. It was previously 30%. And in order to hit that new target, basically Canada used the election in around September to basically announce the ways it was going to do that. So capping, reducing oil and gas sector emissions was an important announcement. A requirement that 100% of new vehicle sales are going to be for zero emission vehicles by 2035 and 50% by 2030. And getting a net zero electricity grid by 2035 were some of the highlights. So at COP, these weren't new announcements, but they were re-announced. And so now we have a sitting government pledging to do these things on the world stage. They aren't just election promises as they were a few months ago. Globally speaking, we finished COP one step closer to our climate goals, perhaps still not close enough. But I understand that even if we meet the new pledges, the 2030 ones, we're still on a path to over 2 degrees of warming. And obviously 2030 it sounds distant, but it's actually not. It's just over 8 years from now. So that timeline is a little bit worrying. But as others have pointed out, real progress was made, and that's how change happens, not all at once. So it's I guess I have mixed feelings, but I'm also a glass half full person.
Yeah, well, so each of you has brought up a little bit of a different angle. We've got, the finance and the pledges leading to action. We've got specific Canadian policies. We've got the partnerships and the sort of spillover alliances that have been made. So with each of those in mind, and going to each of you, I want to talk a little bit about what seems to have changed in that conversation. So for years, we've heard climate change was a collective action problem. There was not really a big incentive to be a first mover. It was always, everyone else could free ride and take advantage of someone who's going to go too far, too fast. that seems to be getting challenged more and more as countries take bigger, bolder steps, try to seize areas. Batteries is one piece, that there's increasing competition for. So with some of those takeaways from Glasgow in mind, I'm interested in, Sybil, maybe going to you first, and whether this is at that partnerships or other pieces. Do you think that notion of climate change as a collective action problem is still relevant? Have we entered a new phase in how countries and perhaps alliances are looking at climate action and what needs to happen?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I guess one thing I'd like to kind of frame here is that number one, at COPs are not only this high-level negotiations among countries, right? But also there's a huge amount of activity going on that is approved, in a sense, allowed by the UNFCCC to observers that are not part of the negotiating teams, but that are there as observers and are doing a whole lot. They're putting on a whole lot of panel discussions, reporting out on what's going on at various levels in business, in subnational governments, in a range of industries, NGOs, indigenous, et cetera. And so that's where you get a lot of information about what's happening on the ground, actually. And one of the things that I saw repeatedly in these sessions was the action that businesses are taking and looking at in terms of not just looking at decreasing their own emissions, but also looking at their supply chains and how can they not only choose their supply chains, their products that they're needing to be ones that are low emissions and that also are considering the adaptation issues, but also really trying to help those companies to decrease their emissions and also to be resilient to climate change. So I think there's been a shift from just saying, okay, we've got to have action at the national level, to companies saying, we've got to get on with this. We've got to take, things into our hands. We don't want to be left behind. We know that it's a changing environment, that climate change is here, that we need to be moving and we need to be acting, not just sort of looking at what the policies are that are coming out from government. Not that government isn't critically important in signaling where things are going and where, giving strong signals that give the private sector the confidence to make changes. But I'm seeing that there's more and more action going on at the individual company level and looking at their not only direct emissions, but their supply chains and also then their downstream customers as well. So I see a real shift there that I haven't seen before.
Barbara, how about from your perspective, just picking up on a lot of those points and knowing your sort of deep expertise in all things climate finance, has a similar shift taken place in the financial instruments that are being discussed in the investor community? Would you say that's been a leading piece of the conversation change, or is that following a broader shift?
I think there is a shift, and Sybil actually very much agree with what you said as well. But I do think, it's the leaders in, financial institutions, in companies, they actually see that, who, try to, get ahead of the curve. But at the same time, many of the other companies realize they have to do it. I mean, if you look at the European Union taxonomies, there is like regulations, mandatory, reporting is coming. So that is actually triggering them to finally look at their own portfolios and making changes. But certainly what we have seen coming out of all these different incentives, both understanding the opportunities, which is what you said, and I think there are also real opportunities for financial institutions, both public and private, to really kind of, scale up their investments in climate relevant activities, but also understanding some of the triggers or basically the incentives coming from governments. But all that said, certainly have never seen that many announcements coming out from non-state actors, from private sector. You have a huge announcements around kind of private financial institutions action. Again, the devil lies in the detail. Now the announcements are there, but there's been a lot of discussion. How can we make sure that really translates into concrete action, not only from the leaders that Sybil has mentioned, but really across the the financial system that then will allow a real shift to happen. But I do see that there is a change. It's a change in the narrative as well. Like it's a change in the narrative that, yeah, it's not only it's bad, you know, we have to do climate action. It's actually, you can see that there's opportunities. Electric vehicles, again, there's a lot of, you know, research and development going on. There's a lot of new technologies that are being explored, from hydrogen to others, where you really kind of see, you know, kind of a change in the narrative, realizing that there are opportunities that that really kind of allow actors that have not been in the game basically come in and do more. But I think the other new piece, and Sybil mentioned that, and I should have mentioned that as well, but for me is one of the highlights of COP was the South Africa deal. I think that one really highlighted this, you know, the different approach to climate action, having, you know, a collaborative plan to fund a just transition basically away from coal, but with an eye and a structure to mobilize private investment, and really having a national ownership as key there. And I think this is, again, coming a little bit back to your question, Evan, that like back from the collective, you know, work towards climate action, but really bringing it back to the national ownership.
Sybil, did you want to jump back in there?
I just wanted to follow up a little bit and with some of the things Barbara's saying, but as well, which is that, you know, we also have to realize, I think, that companies, other entities don't necessarily know how to do this, right? They've been developed and working in a different mode, right? And I think that we need to realize that our universities have a great role to play, a very important role to play in bringing the expertise that they might have to work with companies, to work with communities, and helping them to co-develop better ways of moving forward, ones that are economically positive, ones that are make them more resilient, decrease their climate risk, et cetera. And I'll just put in a plug for PICS, which is exactly what we do. We fund research here in BC between the university experts and those in private sector, in government and communities, First Nations, to really bring people together to say, what are the problems that you're having, and how can we bring expertise from the university to help you with that? So I think we have to realize we really need everything coming together to help with this incredibly important transition.
Well, and I think it's actually a really good way of highlighting, perhaps for me, where that narrative seems to have shifted, is it's no longer, oh, we have these COP conferences and the governments will talk about climate change for a period of time and then it's back to usual. The conversations spill over into other industries, other sectors. It's becoming a conversation that everyone is part of. So again, back to the alliances and all of the different places this is happening. Trevor, from a bit more of a Canada perspective, speak a little bit to how you've seen Canada's role in this evolve over time. Would you say that we're trying to step out ahead of this? Is this something where we're still trying to sort of stick with the pack when we think about what actions we're putting in place, and sort of how we're evaluating the action that Canada's taken?
Sure. I want to get back to that concept you brought up. Collective action problem is climate action a collective action problem, and certainly to some degree it is. Two ways to get around a collective action problem. One is regulation. You know, that's easier at a state level, and it can be more complicated, of course, at a global level, which is what COP is for. And the other way of getting around a collective action problem is competition. If companies have a competitive incentive to get out ahead, they're going to start doing that. So Tesla is now the most valuable car company in the world, and it's not even close. And Rivian, which makes electric trucks, which hasn't even sold any trucks yet publicly, they're now up there as well. And so, you know, say what you will about the stock market, but investors are, you know, basically placing their bets on these companies that are going to potentially play a huge role in the new economy. You know, here in BC, to bring it to Canada, to BC, you know, we have Ballard, which has been around for decades, and they've been rebounding in recent years, in part because of strong demand for fuel cells that are used in electric buses and trucks in China and elsewhere. I think they employ something like 800 people now, last I checked. Corvus in Richmond, another company, they're a leader in manufacturing batteries for electric ferries. They're selling to Europe. Carbon Engineering is Squamish. General Fusion in Burnaby. These companies have some real big name investors. Other sectors of BC's economy as well are critical, mining, sustainable mining for the metals and minerals that are used in EVs, wind turbines, solar panels, energy efficiency in construction. Construction is a huge sector in BC. Underpinning all of that, BC has an electricity grid that's, mostly clean, and clean electricity is going to underpin so much of what we do. From powering operations, with industry, and it can potentially underpin a green hydrogen sector as well, which uses clean electricity. And green hydrogen does factor in pretty heavily in a lot of net zero scenarios we see. We don't quite know how much it's going to grow, but BC has, and Canada in general, has real good potential for it. And I know BC does have a hydrogen strategy. Canada has one as well. So, I think we just need to think about these low carbon products, using our clean electricity to produce them as like a premium sticker. And because we know that places like Europe and America, they're looking at carbon tariffs. And so that premium sticker is actually potentially going to become vital. So this isn't just about the clean energy sector, it's about every sector, it's about every export in Canada. So absolutely, an economic strategy and the climate plan, these things are very linked. I know governments are thinking about it more and more. I would say they're not thinking about it enough, not as ambitiously as governments in like Germany and Europe are, but certainly these discussions are very alive right now.
So yeah, Barbara, maybe I want to go to you with that, because Trevor, you've sort of gone exactly where the question I'm most excited to ask, which is, we talk about climate and it feels like finally it's no longer this silo of environmental policy where we have it and then we do everything we want to do. It seems like we're starting to sort of really mash together our economic policy and our climate policy by necessity. Barbara, when you look at global leaders, whether that's companies, whether that's countries, who's getting it right? Who's bringing that right balance of climate and economy, or who are you looking to for sort of guidance on the next step, more so than the last step?
Well, just coming back, I think lots of countries are saying the right things now. I mean, I've also seen your president and the latest speech from Trudeau, and I think there is, it's a good program. Everyone understands you need a systemic transformation, transition. We've seen obviously a few countries, and Trevor mentioned already in Europe. I think there is certainly some who have been kind of leading the way. Also the ones that Sybil mentioned that are part of the South Africa deal, certainly, from the European Union or Germany. But I think generally we're still too cautious. I think, if you just bring it back a little bit to, again, the finance piece, if you look overarching how much money you would need in order to get us on a 1.5 degree Celsius pathway, that's in the trillions. It's like, there's estimates from different organizations that say you need around $4 to $6 trillion US dollars per year in terms of investments, to ensure that there's a systemic shift, a transition that really mainstreams what you say, climate into, every part of the economic policy and the economic system. And our figures from CPI show that at the moment we are around 630 billion globally, which is all public and private investments that we can track, which is good news. It's been, growing over the last few years, but it's still falling far short of where we need to go. And we continue to see investments into, high carbon assets, into fossil fuel assets. So if we want to really bend the curve, then we need some real action, and we need to, both scale up what works, like South Africa deals, and you've actually mentioned before, I didn't reply to your question on innovative financial business models. There's a lot going on, and we also have an incubator where we do similar, like Sybil, try to bring together, financial institutions and entrepreneurs and help kind of come up with what could be deals that could be replicated and getting us to scale. But it's just going too slow at the moment. So I think what we really need is to make sure that, we mainstream this climate across the whole financial ecosystem, economic ecosystem, and this way really change some of the ways that capital is allocated. And I think a prime candidate here is also making sure that we use public resources more effectively. And there's been a lot of discussion finally at COP around the need to really do a full kind of refresh of the development finance system. And I think whom I'm looking for, I'm looking to the G7, I'm looking to the G20. We need to change the mandates of these institutions and make sure that public finance really goes to the harder areas, to the areas that need kind of scaling up beyond renewable energy, as Trevor said, and that we don't crowd out private investments with public finance. And I think that is something to look for. So I think this is the countries, certainly the leading countries I'm looking for, but at the same time, also very closely watching the countries that are high emitters from fossil fuels. I think this is like the South Africa deal. We need other deals where we have the national ownership from countries like India, like Indonesia, that work together with others, that enable them really kind of to change the pathway of some of their energy transitions. And I think this is what will really make or break the transition within the next decade, actually.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of more public conversation around public resources being seen as something that needs to be used to crowd in private investment rather than deploying it in areas where it simply is taking the space of what we need companies and others to be doing. So, Sybil, how about yourself? Climate and economy, what's your take?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on something which is, I think very real to everybody here in BC right now. But in a broader sense, I think it's companies, countries, individuals are becoming more and more aware of what's called the burden of delay. And that burden of delay is not only the burden that comes with not acting quick enough and having to really ramp down more and more quickly the longer we wait in order to stay below 2. For goodness sake, if we're going to stay below 1.5, tomorrow is here. So I think that that in part the transitions that we're seeing in activity in the private sector, but also in countries, is because countries are becoming more and more aware of that burden. And here in BC, it's, as we know, it's been incredibly in our face this week and last summer and the summers before that, in terms of the floods that we're having now, in terms of the wildfires, in terms of the droughts in the summer, in terms of the heat domes. So I think that it's as somebody said at COP, we've moved beyond graphs to now images. So we're no longer looking at model outputs to drive us. We're experiencing the impacts of climate change and how critical it is that we act very quickly. There was just a report coming out from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices on the importance of looking at our infrastructure and how the costs of bringing our infrastructure up to decrease the climate risk. We just saw this week all these bridges collapsing, for example. So, we have to wake up, as we've always said, but it's now becoming more and more apparent that it's not just numbers on a graph, it's actually a reality.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way of summarizing, again, that narrative shift in how things have gone. We're not just talking numbers and targets anymore. It's so much more real, both in the impacts, but I think also in some of the solutions. It feels like we're talking more tangibly about the what needs to happen rather than just sort of the abstractions. We need to decarbonize our energy grid. Trevor, I pull you back in here.
Sure, just want to quickly, because we were talking a bunch about finance and investment and which is great, but if you poll Canadians and you ask them what they're more excited about, finance or being having a more competitive economy or job creation, trust me, job creation is going to poll is the most important thing for Canadians. So that's another, as we talk about, we say trillions of dollars and being invested to make this transition happen. One of the actual great stories out of that is it is going to be a job creator. One of the things about a legacy sunsetting industry is like oil and gas is it tends to automate more and more. And so that's one of the ways in which jobs are lost. I think the IEA did model out the net zero scenario, the International Energy Agency, and did find more jobs created in clean energy than would be lost in fossil fuels. And I can say that we, Clean Energy Canada, have also modeled that scenario in Canada and found the same thing. So that's a great story that needs to get told, especially as we're trying to win over everyday Canadians who don't think too much about economic competitiveness. Is that this is a good job creator.
Great. Yeah.
Just quickly,
Of course
I
you
mean,
can.
I think I fully agree with Trevor, but I think what for me was really important at COP, and what I think is really important that we talk about that more is this just transition? Because yes, there will be more jobs, but yes, there will be losers in the short term, and we need to address that, because otherwise, there's a risk that people just like wants to understand, mining. There will be changes. You need to train. Coming back to Sybil's point, there needs to be education also, like training, building capacity across all levels, from different industries, but also like all financial institutions as well, just to make sure that this is possible. But I think we need into this narrative, which Trevor, I think, certainly is spot on. No one cares about, investments, like talk about like air pollution, benefits for yourself, job creation. But I think we need to finally also deal with the harder issues, because this is the only way that we really make sure that we get everyone on the same, on the same page, and in this way really enable more ambitious action to happen.
I'm really glad you raised that, because it's actually a bunch of research has come out, and it goes back to the collective action problem, and it was challenging this notion that where we are now, that the barrier is collective action, and it instead argues that it's a distributed impact problem, which means whether we choose to try to shift or not, there's winners and losers of the policies. So industries that no longer play as big a role. And in large extent, governments seem to have only just now started to bring a little bit more, I don't want to say honesty, but a bit more of a full conversation about what the impacts will be. It's not all straightforward for everyone. A lot of people face a lot of disruption, whether we choose to act or not choose to act, or how we choose to act. I just want to put out a quick prompt that please put your questions in. I'm going to start to push through audience questions in the next couple minutes here. Perhaps just the last question I'll ask before we do that, and if maybe just a quick hit from each of you on this one. The nature of leadership and the nature of leadership we need today to get these actions going. I think it's been a real topic of conversation. You hear a lot of the critics of governments and industry players and others talk about they just don't get it. There's not enough urgency. There's not enough, comprehensiveness of action. Do you agree? What is the type of leaders that we need right now? Are there unique challenges that we're not accounting for when we think about leadership? What should we be expecting from our leaders at this moment in time to pick that urgency up? And Trevor, I'll start with you, and I'm just going to ask if we can keep it to sort of 60, 90 seconds each, just to start pulling in audience questions here.
Sure. Well, look, politicians are going to be politicians. They're better ones, worse ones that care more about climate change, ones that are more sincere. But they need to stay in power to affect change, and they're never going to forget that. We live in a democracy, and we can't ignore that. I think the question for climate action advocates and communicators especially has to be, how do we make democracy work for us and not against us? Canadians are now, I find, connecting the dots when it comes to climate change. And polls we've done, people are connecting these extreme weather events we've been feeling here in Canada with climate change. But there's a gap, and that gap is on the solution side. People are scared, but they don't really know quite where to aim that fear. They want their government to do more, but they don't really love the carbon tax, and maybe don't call it a carbon tax, and don't charge me to park my new gas guzzler. The problem is, without, I'm going to call it solutions literacy, Canadians will occupy these two different realities, right? So there's one where they worry about climate change, and there's one in which they're lukewarm to the measures that often would do the most to combat it, especially punitive measures, which are often the most effective. So this is a really tough mountain to climb, but I actually think climate solutions literacy might be possible. And I actually looked at COVID, and there are many differences, but with COVID, people actually want the tough policy, that stick policy, not just the nice carrot policy. With COVID, we call it a mask mandate, right? If we adopted the parlance of climate policy, I think we would have called it a clean face standard. So people generally understand why COVID solutions work. And so they want the COVID solutions that really dig in and make a difference. And I think we need to raise literacy around the climate solutions that are the most important. So they want those policies too. And we aren't always on the defensive when it comes to our most important policies. If we can do that, then we're going to make life a lot easier for politicians.
Thanks, Trevor. Sybil, how about for yourself, leadership right now, what we need to sort of pick up that urgency and that comprehensiveness?
Yeah, so I want to just make 2 points here. One is that, yes, individual action is important, individual company action, individual government action, but we cannot forget that 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions globally comes from the burning of coal. And so, you know, there's these 2 sides of the issue, right? In terms of the major emissions that we've got to get those decreased. Now, you in the audience as an individual, as myself as well, cannot probably do anything really about that 40% right now. We've got China, we've got India. Of course, we do have some coal from Canada, the US, et cetera. But that has to be a very high level government policy movement there. So we need action at that scale. And then we also need the action at the local and the individual scale. So leadership is really important in that as well. And you know, the signals that governments give in terms of with policy that gives companies the confidence to move forward with changes, move forward with changing to lower emissions, to a more resilient and climate risk averse approach. So I think that we sometimes get confused and start thinking that it's all about what you as an individual do. That is an important part of it, but we also have to see that there are many other dimensions that have to be addressed, that as an individual you can't necessarily address. The other thing I'll just say is that another really key important thing though that individuals can do, and as Trevor pointed out, we live in a democracy, is vote. And vote for those individuals that are going to be supporting strong climate policy. And yeah, I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Yeah, Barbara, how about yourself? Leadership. I know you were at the COP conference, you ran panels there, you know.
Yeah, well, I think for me, and I try to keep, at least once, I try to keep it short, but for me, leadership is really bold action, but it's coupled with clear transition plans. I think it's time to go beyond the big targets without having and this leadership goes beyond, across public and private. I think, wherever you are, what we need is like clear targets, clear, ambition, but you couple it with a clear transition plan that shows you how you get there and address issues that we've heard about in the panel around just transition and other points.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to come right back to you with our first audience question, Barbara, and very much a climate finance one, but Trevor, Sybil, afterwards, I'd really invite you to give your takes on it as well. So at a subnational level, so whether we're talking about the province of BC and Canada or municipalities within the province, what role do those subnational jurisdictions play on the finance side? What should they be looking at in terms of financial instruments, and how do they bring their financial heft to the greatest impact, within their area of jurisdiction?
Extremely important question. And again, we do a lot at CPA, we do a lot around cities. We're also running another alliance like the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. And I think why we do that is because in the end, cities are critical, subnational actors are critical to climate action. And we see a lot of them ready to act, but we really need to unlock the finance and the access to finance to enable them to do so. If you just again, the big picture, about 75% of global CO2 emissions originate actually from urban areas. And that's a huge, not only going to, it's a huge part already today, it's only going to increase going forward if you look at the predictions. So what we see is that there's, already a number, there's financial solutions, there's specific, ways that we could ensure that, investment flows to subnational areas, to cities, and really helps basically green the cities. But very often it's still complicated in terms of accessing it. Very often cities can't directly access funding from, for example, multilateral development agencies, or from sometimes, even from bilateral aid agencies or governments. So there needs to be really a change in both, I think, the enabling environment for cities. So really, again, coming back to the question that the point also that Trevor made before, regulations or changes in the mandate. So really making sure that there is a way for subnational actors to access that finance, but then at the same time, you also need to help them build the capacity. I think very often, these actors just don't have the capacity to understand what are good deals, how to structure these deals. So really coming back to the point around, what are business models, what are financial instruments that are out there, helping them understand them, and then basically helping match between the deals and that. So there's a number of, for example, project preparation facilities specific for subnational actors. And that's something where, they can really get help to kind of get support to understand, how can they, access the finance, what are some of the technical details that still need to sort out, and, who are the ones that they could approach. So again, maybe I'll drop just a link in the chat box here, just on the Cities Alliance that we're running. There's a lot of work we do around, lessons. What are the good enabling environments? What are good financial instruments? How can we aggregate smaller scale transaction that very often happen at the city level, at the urban level, at the subnational level, to make it really attractive then for investors to kind of come in and enable basically the greening of these areas. But just like to come back to my initial point, extremely important. And if we don't solve that issue, I think then we will have a very hard way to actually getting to our climate targets if we don't really solve the cities, the urban, the subnational finance point there.
Yeah, so Sybil, Trevor, just before pulling either of you in on that answer. So if from a municipal policy side, a lot is made around the land use policy piece as well. Is there a component to that around investment and around policy that you would highlight as sort of the top priority for municipalities?
Are you asking?
Yeah, sorry, for yourself,
Trevor and
Sybil.
myself about that? Can I comment on a little bit something different, which is what
Absolutely.
I'd really like to bring forward, given that we have only a few minutes left, which is that I totally agree with what Barbara said about the numbers and how important cities are around the world as collectively in terms of emissions. But what I think we also need to remember, and I think that we really haven't addressed this in this session, is that yes, while cities are huge in terms of the total emissions, we always have to remember these small outlying, more remote communities that in themselves are struggling to be able to reduce their emissions. Here in BC, we have so much attention on Vancouver and Victoria and and other fairly large municipalities, but we cannot leave behind our small outlying communities in rural communities, those which have already suffered because of climate change and will continue to in the future. And I think it's a similar situation around the world, is that while they are not the big emitters, they are critically important to our economy and to our society. I just wanted to be sure I got that point in.
Yeah, for sure. Trevor, anything you'd add to it, municipalities, land use policy or otherwise?
Sure. I mean, city is one of their challenges is they don't have a lot of money. I think I'm going on memory here, but I feel like something like 8% of all tax revenue actually goes to municipalities. It's pretty tied up here in Canada. And so they're often left pleading with the province or the federal government to get funding to support any sort of large, say, transportation project, for example. But they do certainly have power when it comes to regulation, and provinces certainly have a lot of power when it comes to things like electricity and financing as well. I think this is something though where cities are at the forefront though of adaptation, of dealing with the effects of climate change, and often know their cities best in terms of transit needs, for example. And I think that there's real value in having every level of government work together. And I'll give Vancouver as an example with electric vehicles. Vancouver, I think, has the highest percentage of electric vehicles on the roads of any city in the country. And it's a case where every level of government has supported that. And that's why that's the case. So at a federal level, we have a federal EV rebate of $5,000 people can get. Provincially in BC, we have a $3,000 rebate that stacks on top of the $5,000 rebate, as well as a zero emission vehicle mandate in the province requiring automakers to sell more EVs into the province, support for charging. And at a city level, of course, you have the city also implementing regulations supporting EV policy, including in new buildings, requiring that the wiring in a new building is set up, because maybe you can get your incentive to buy the EV. Maybe there's more charging stations on the highway now, so you're not worried about that. Oh, but if you're an apartment building, if you can't if you can't install a charger in your parkade, you can't get through your strata or something, that's a problem. That's kind of an area where the city can play. So EV adoption is a really complex area where literally every level of government plays an important role to make that happen. So yeah, I mean, climate change, it's an every level of government kind of problem. And if they're not all working together, there's going to be a missing piece somewhere.
Great, that's awesome. I think we're going to do one more quick audience question, and then we're going to have to summarize and wrap up this session. Sybil, maybe starting with yourself. From your perspective, the action commitment level, so the commitments government made at COP26, do you see the commitments they've come out with as, you know, sufficient or with enough heft that they can create that demand for the private sector to really displace a lot of the carbon intensive industries at a fast enough rate? So have governments essentially created enough on the demand side with setting greater targets, bringing in greater, you know, transition policies in place, that the private sector has now got the incentive to really act with more urgency? Or are we still a little bit shy of what we need to really trigger widespread private sector action?
I think we're way, way off from what you just said. We are nowhere near what needs to be done. I think that the signals coming out of Glasgow, while there were some positive signals, as the president of the COP said, you know, we are, you know, we can still maybe hold on to 1.5. You know, he was being political when he said that. You know, the commitments by countries are not going to keep us below 2. They're not going to keep us anywhere near 1.5 right now. And unless countries really, really ratchet up their commitments, and it's not, as we've said throughout this whole session, it's not just commitments, it's the implementation when they go back home. So it's the policies they put in place when they go back home. So no, I don't think that we're on the right level of ambition. I think we need much more, and I think we need much more to really continue to give the message, the signals to the private sector so that they can move forward more aggressively as well.
Trevor, Barbara, anything you'd want to add to that?
Well, I certainly fully agree with Sybil. I mean, we're certainly nowhere near where we need to be. But I think we need just much more accountability also for all the actors. I think, again, so many announcements, so many alliances, so many coalitions, great things happening, but we need accountability. We need to make sure that these announcements really lead to some concrete action. And again, we need to obviously make sure that that happens on the public side, but also on the private side. I think it's time kind of also for the private sector to really kind of realize and better account for the risks in their portfolio going forward, and therefore not only ask for, you know, the public sector to help de-risk some of their investments and changes in their portfolios, but at the same time also really make sure that they help, you know, they start kind of scaling their investments and basically mainstream climate across their portfolios, including the counterparts that and the value chain that Sybil mentioned, which I think is so important. But again, glass half full person here. So I think there were signs of hope, and I think this next year is extremely important. So I think we need all hands on deck from everyone here, and really making sure that we ask our governments and our kind of leaders across the economy, private sector, to really do more, and next year come back with more ambition in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Trevor, last word on this question.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I had the idea and then it fell out of my head for a second. Right. So I think, you know, if I were an economist, classic economist, I'd tell you, well, just, you know, super high carbon price on everything. That's the most economic efficient policy. But what we're seeing happen around the world right now is a bunch of jurisdictions, countries investing heavily to build certain sectors. Hydrogen is a good example. Places like Australia, Germany, pumping a bunch of money into them to build up those sectors. We're seeing it South Korea, you know, with electric vehicles, elsewhere. So America right now, Biden's whole approach, you know, we're seeing more sort of economic planning than I think we saw a couple decades ago. And so if we just take this approach of, well, we just put a high carbon tax on everything, which I mean, politically impossible anyway, I think we'd actually maybe not get a foothold in key industries fast enough, because again, it comes back to competition. If other countries are very proactively, you know, developing strategies around building particular sectors and putting money into it, Canada is just going to fall behind if we don't do the same thing. So, hydrogen is an important area. Recently, our organization's been talking a lot about building an a battery supply chain, electric vehicle battery supply chain, because we have all of the components that would go into that supply chain here in Canada. And that actually requires taking very proactive steps, negotiating with automakers to try to set up shop here in Canada, supporting Canadian companies. Again, if you don't get your foothold in those sectors sometimes, then you're playing catch up later, or you just can't get your foothold in. So I think that's a very important area.
Yeah, so I'm gonna wrap us up now, and I have a final question that I'm gonna ask each of you, and just to take a few seconds on. But we've talked about urgency, we've talked about using public resources more effectively, especially in ways that aren't crowding out private investments and the role they need to play. We've talked about moving on from just numbers, and that somewhat has happened, and that we need to start talking much more about concrete actions. We've talked about accountability. We've talked about leadership across the different sectors. Barbara, I'm very much the same as you in that I am a glass half full person. So I think any conversation around climate today, with how overwhelming, how daunting, how many different areas need more urgency, more action, we always need to end on a bit of hope about what is the reason to keep working and fighting and pushing for more. So if there was one thing, whether it's a leading country, a leading policy, what's something that you see as something that's giving you purpose in this, something that you're excited to see, something that's creating that momentum on one or more of these priorities that we've established today?
Again, I actually have seen lots of positive movement and lots of positive examples, but I think just as we've talked about that before, I do want to come back to the South Africa example. If we manage to help South Africa move away from coal, I think that is like an amazing deal, and that needs to be replicated. We need many more of those, but I think that is something that really gives me hope and really, makes me think that we can still do it, and we will manage to, stick to our 1.5 degrees Celsius target.
Trevor, how about for you?
Probably the fact that we actually have a lot of the solutions we already need today to decarbonize most sectors. There are some difficult ones where those technologies are going to mature a bit more in the 2030s, but for the most part, we have the technology to decarbonize much of our economy, and it's largely cost competitive. So I wish increasingly people are getting that, but I still wish more people understood that. But I know that, and it gives me hope. Because when that happens, you start to see the momentum come also from the private sector as well as from government as well, and that's where the snowball can really get rolling.
Sybil, last word to you. What's your sort of hopeful hook right now?
So both what gives me pause and what gives me hope is youth. And I think that the youth movement around the world is critically important. It's critically important because, as we know, they are the receptors of what's going to be happening over this coming decades, the coming centuries. And we need to pay attention to them. And we need to really take that seriously on board in terms of our commitments, our being the global hour, and really take that seriously and to embrace that. That's my final point.
Okay, thank you all. I really appreciate all of your time and your insights into this. I think, one of the most important conversations we can be having. And thanks to SIP for making sure there was space for this conversation during their Rising Economy Week. I believe I'm handing this over to Kieran for some final remarks.
Thanks, Evan, and thank you to all our speakers for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge. And thank you to the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions and the University of Victoria's VI3 Hub for sponsoring this important conversation. And we also want to thank our presenting sponsor, RBC, and our innovation sponsor, BC Ferries, for supporting Rising Economy Week. We encourage you to head back to the Hoover platform to continue the conversation. And finally, don't miss our final afternoon event today with award-winning author Dan Bresnitz at 1:30 p.m. This event will be in person and online with his keynote presentation, Innovation in Real Places, Strategies for Prosperity in an Unforgiving World. We hope you have enjoyed Rising Economy Week and all the amazing conversations. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.